Please join me in welcoming Martin McDonagh. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I understand you were at Saturday Night Live last night. How was that?
Yep, Brendan Gleeson was hosting, and I was along for moral support, as was Colin. It was good. It was really good fun, but it finished like 4 a.m, so I'm surprisingly feeling quite good, though.
The tired life of the traveling artist.
Yeah.
But you know what was great about seeing Brendan Gleeson host SNL last night is that you've had this wonderful sort of kinship with that actor. Of course, as we saw in the clip reel, not only did you work with him and Kohn prior to this in Bruges, but also in your short film that won the Oscar that was also here, Six Shooter. So how did that sort of relationship first start for you?
Well, weirdly, I also worked with his son Donal on Donal's first ever job on a play called Lieutenant of Inishmore in, I think it was London, and then it came to New York. So I knew Donal even before Brendan. But Brendan I'd met, he'd come to some of my plays, and I loved him as an actor for like years before that. So there was a kind of a slight connection beforehand, before I sent the script of Six Shooter to him. And we chatted about it, and he said he had some reservations about the violence, but he said yes pretty quickly. And he kind of helped me through that. It was my first ever directing job, I guess, technically. And I hadn't been to film school or done any of that stuff. I'd loved films since I was a kid, but didn't know how to make one. So he really kind of helped. He's such a lovely guy that he kind of helps protect you on that, especially from any kind of producerial interference, and just kind of help guide me through the whole thing.
When you transitioned into directing film, first with a short film and then with the feature in Bruges several years later, you had already really established yourself as a playwright. And you know, a lot of times artists do a ton of different interviews, and one quote comes back to haunt them. And I don't know how you feel about this one, but I did read somewhere where you said you can't be as edgy in theater. That film lets you do that more, which I think to some people translated as somehow he likes movies. He likes being a filmmaker more. And I'm sort of curious how you look at the different challenges of the two media, because I assume if you didn't like theater, you wouldn't still be writing theater, and you have a lot going on there. But where do you sort of feel most comfortable these days?
Gosh, that's a good question. I always preferred movies to plays, because I was never really brought up on plays, and the ones I did see as a kid were very dull. I grew up in England, but I did feel like, conversely, I did want to put the edginess of movies onto the stage, and that kind of worked for a bunch of years, and still does, I think. But the dream was always to at least make one film, and I was never sure if I would ever get to do it. But after about 10 years of the plays going well, and after making the short film, which went well, access was there, and I'd already written, I think, the script of Bruges even before the short film got made. So the short film and the success it had didn't really hinder any of that stuff. But yeah, in Bruges was the first thing to jump into.
So just to back up for a second, what was your entry point into storytelling? Were there certain films that you were watching that made you want to kind of go in a certain direction as a writer and director?
Yeah, I mean, everything, probably American movies of the 70s is probably my biggest influence on the plays and films, probably. Like, as a kid, like even like 11, 12-year-old kid, I got into all the De Niro, Scorsese movies from the 70s. Like, I saw them like back to back over the course of a week or two, I think. And Terrence Malick, and then through those people, you get into the older greats like Orson Welles, and when you go down that route, you get into the great foreign filmmakers like Kurosawa and all those guys. So I had a kind of broad spectrum of the kind of movies I loved, if not wanted to make, and then sort of tried to take a lot of that those influences onto stage first, and then it was a natural thing to progress onto movies.
So, as a filmmaker, how did you see sort of your sensibility translating? Because one thing that's obviously very different is, you know, when you're in a theater and you're seeing actors in front of you and you're experiencing this, the audience in some ways is part of the show. Whereas when you make a movie, it goes out, sometimes it's showing to a receptive audience, sometimes it's a different kind of audience. The context changes all over the place. I can imagine that being a very scary thing for somebody who's created a play often for one site-specific sort of experience in the past.
I don't think I really differentiate in that way too much. Even like making Banshees, you do kind of leave a little air after a big joke line, for instance, just as you would in a play. So that isn't too different. I don't think I really take the audience into consideration too much in writing a play. Some of my plays have been described as, you know, kind of being shocking or having shock value, but that was never an attempt. You know, I never really wanted to do that. But I think if you like plot twists, and if you like shaking up a story, shocking things sometimes pop up by accident.
Accident, really. Caught completely off guard when something very violent suddenly happens.
Very much so, yeah.
But they're often...
There was a cat that exploded in one of my plays. I didn't see that coming. Then you have to work out, okay, if we have to, how do we go about doing that?
Well,
no cats were ever harmed in any of these productions.
You're legally obligated to say that every time.
No, I'm a vegetarian, so like I'm a big, care about that a lot.
Well, your plays are often described as black comedies, which is, if you've seen the plays, I mean, they really lean on the black, but the comedy is, if not a relief, it sort of opens up the bleakness of these scenarios, and I wonder for you how that process has sort of evolved over time.
They all tend to come out that way. It's not a conscious move. I guess it's sort of the way I see the world to a degree. You see the bleakness and see the existential dread, but you'd be very depressed if you stayed in that headspace, I think. And a lot of things you've got to laugh at or you'll cry, as they say. But I think it's just my natural, I don't know if it's an Irish thing, but it's just a natural disposition to not wallow. I mean, the Banshees, which hopefully you'll all see later or soon, it's a sad film as much as anything else, I think. But it's not just that. I think you have to have, and it's not a deliberate thing. I almost did set out deliberately to try and make a sad thing, but not just that. You have to have fun with it, and I think it's one of my funniest as well as being probably the saddest.
When you're writing, do you practice the lines aloud, or how do you know when certain things are going to land? Because I will say, having seen this movie, I mean, there are a lot of great laugh moments, but they're very unexpected.
Yeah, I enjoy that writing process, to be surprised by what a character will say. I never plot anything out to begin at the outset, so there's no sort of treatment to follow. I never know what's going to happen at the end, and I think writing that way there's a release to that, and it's enjoyable because I never know what a character's going to say or what's going to happen next. There's a scene. It's in the trailer, but I still don't want to spoil it, where Brendan's character comes into the bar and he makes a threat about halfway into the film.
A very violent threat.
A violent threat about, unless you stop talking to me, something bad's going to happen, which kind of sets up the whole rest of the movie. But I didn't know until he walked into that bar that he was going to say that. That wasn't plotted. But when you put something weird, it's a weird moment, out there, like 20, 30 pages in, everything else after that has to follow somehow that crazy, and you have to follow it logically, I think. So you set up a crazy thing, but follow it logically afterwards. And I think that's what makes this film kind of interesting. It's the weird logic that follows after that madness.
Yeah, and it's sort of a almost like subversive buddy movie in a way, which I would also say of In Bruges, the last time you put these two actors together. So I wonder what compelled you to bring them back together. It's a very different kind of dynamic here in a way, but you know they're both again dark comedies.
Yeah, well, I love them both. They love each other so much, and we'd. It's 14 years since Bruges, but it feels like a couple of days, to be honest. But we remained friends in the intervening years. I made obviously Seven Psychos with Colin and stayed friendly with Brendan. But we always would meet up, you know, every sort of year or 2 years, and you know, want to do something. But then I got the idea of this maybe about 3 years ago, just pre-pandemic, and wrote it and sent it them, and it felt like the perfect follow-up, I guess. People love In Bruges a lot, and part of my thinking was you didn't want to let those fans down, at the same time as you didn't want to replicate exactly what that was. So I knew this was going to be something stranger and a little sadder, a little definitely different, but not to do anything lesser than In Bruges was in all our minds, I think.
The other part of it that's notable is that for you, as someone who, you know, you're British, but your parents were Irish, it's dealing with Irish history, a very specific location and moment in time in the Troubles and so forth. So I'm curious about what it was like for you to return to that milieu. I mean, you really hadn't made a film with that backdrop at all since Six Shooter. And you've made films now set in America. You've been plays set in America. So, you know, what compelled you to go back?
It's just a natural way of writing, I think. And it didn't feel any different to the plays, and the plays are always sort of going on, so I'm always sort of a part of that process if there's a big production of one of the Irish plays going on. So I don't even feel like it's a return to that kind of stuff, because it's always there, either in my head or in the theatre work that I'm doing. But I did want to make a beautiful, you know, to show Ireland in its beauty, and I don't really feel that that's been captured enough in the movies. You know, a lot of Irish films tend to be. I mean, a lot of them are very low budget anyway. So, but the cinema of them sometimes can be lost because of that, I think. So to capture the beauty of Ireland, and a lot of that was, and of the west of Ireland particularly, was uppermost in all our minds, I think. Ben Davis, who photographed, I keep pointing here as if it's not that there, but he photographed this one and Three Billboards and Seven Psychopaths. But we really, really wanted to. I mean, Days of Heaven was probably our biggest touchstone for Banshees, to try and attempt to capture the beauty and the poetic beauty of that film was what we were going for.
And can you tell us a little bit about where you actually shot the movie, what it was like to be out there?
We were based in Galway, which is my favourite town in Ireland, if anyone ever gets out there. And we shot on one of the Aran Islands, Inishmore, the biggest of the 3 Aran Islands, which is another lovely place. I used to think it was the most touristy one, but there's something quite spiritual and magical about it. So we filmed there for 3 weeks, and then on Achill Island, which is further up the coast in the county of Mayo. And that's another. I didn't really know at the Achill area so much, but it's really quite beautiful too. Inishmore is quite flat, loads of kind of tiny green fields and grey stone walls. And Achill is much more sort of rugged and mountainous. And a part of the trick was to match those two places, to still make it feel like an island, but to have it feel like Brendan Gleeson's side is the rugged, weirder terrain, to kind of match his character a little bit, and the simple walled, flat aspects of Inishmore was more Colin Farrell's.
Now, this was your first movie that you made, not only quite a number of years, but sort of in the aftermath of all of these crazy things that have happened in the world that have affected how we make movies. And I wonder what it was like for you to get back on a set and just get out there and start making something. It looks like you shot a lot outside, so maybe that helped.
Yeah, and it was on an island, 2 islands. So it was, and Inishmore and all the Aran Islands actually kind of closed down to the public during the pandemic. You couldn't get, only people who lived there could go back and forth, and deliveries and so forth. But there was absolutely no movement, so they were completely protected. There wasn't a single case of COVID during the whole pandemic. So we kind of continued that. We didn't want to affect that. We started shooting post the worst of it, but we were isolated, and the whole crew was just based out there. They weren't going back to a major town. They were staying in cottages, and so it was kind of actually the most idyllic, perfect way to make a COVID film to a degree.
Now, what has this experience been like for you the last 2 years in the pandemic? And there were all these big questions in 2020 about theater in particular, seeing this sort of existential crisis, which perhaps we're in a different phase now. Obviously, Hangman, your play was recently restaged on Broadway, got a Tony nomination, but so it feels like we're sort of through that. But there was a moment in time when a lot of people were uncertain. So how did that affect you?
Well, the first version of Hangman on Broadway was literally, we were 10 previews in, and the news came that Broadway was closing down. So it was like really sad, especially for the younger members of the cast. And it was their sort of big Broadway chance to have that taken away from. There was like tears, and it was just horrible. Luckily, we all got them back together just this year, so they all came back and did it for 3 months. But yeah, there was a worry that, as you say, theatre especially, when we're all sitting next to each other, and it's is that going to be gone if this thing remains? But it feels like we're not quite. It's theatre-wise, we're not quite. Don't think the play played to capacity any time, even though it got good reviews. But it's slowly. There's still like 75-80% of that. And 2 years ago, we were happy just to open the theatres, and I'm glad we have.
I look back at some of the films that you made, and what's interesting is that a lot of times you see a filmmaker make a smaller film, and then they expand in ambition and scope, which...
I'm going the reverse direction.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean...
What does that say about me?
Psychopaths and 3 Billboards had had bigger casts to some degree, and there were perhaps a few more layers in terms of subplots and so forth. And this one, you're back to a handful of characters. It feels like a more natural sort of extension of what you do on the stage to some degree, and I'm curious about that right now.
I'd almost say that if you look at it from In Bruges on, I think Seven Psychos was almost the blip of a lot of sort of famous people and crazy situations and all that stuff. But Bruges, Billboards, and this, they all are almost sort of play-like stories. There's not that many characters. In Bruges, there's 3 basically, and 3 sub characters. This has 10 actors in total, and most of them I'd worked with before, weirdly. And 3 Billboards is sort of 3 people too. So for me, it feels like just 3 short stories almost. I think this is probably my quietest film of the 4, but I kind of like that. I kind of 3 Billboards had a lot of success, but I don't really care about that stuff so much as being able to tell us the next story freely, and I don't work that often anyway. So it was good to wait and come up with something that's very different to 3 Billboards, and possibly very different to the other 2 films too.
The other through line is that there's often a gathering point in your stories where the whole cast or the main characters tend to find each other, and that place tends to be a bar. The Hangman has a bar,
like in real life, right?
Starting to see a pattern here, but I'm curious about that, because when people see In Bruges, you'll see the bar has a really specific identity, as sort of, it's almost like it's the town hall, it's everything for this island. And I wondered sort of how you approach kind of that sort of central locale and how you stage action around that.
Well, I guess definitely in Irish life in those days, it is apart from the church, it was the meeting place, and a more moral meeting place than the church, but I prefer bars. I guess, but it was also, there were aspects of this movie that's a Western, I think, an Irish Western, and the 2 gunslingers coming into the bar, of an afternoon, or as the story gets more dangerous was more of a factor than, you know, the staging of meeting in a bar or anything like that.
And how about music? Music is a big element for you, and in this movie in particular, one thing that we're getting is a lot of the way in which the musicians cluster at the bar, and music ends up being sort of almost like a narrative device in a way. How did that sort of come into it for you?
Well, that is very true of Irish bars. You know, if you do go to Galway, I feel like I'm representing the Irish Tourist Board. But you can find any number of pubs where there'll be a session of local musicians who turn up and play for themselves, just for the fun of it. So that is an aspect of this. It's just a natural Irish thing, I think. But in terms of the other music, I always, like, there's pieces of classical music in Banshees, and there was in Bruges and all the other films too. And I usually have like a little playlist of either leader or classic pieces that I kind of at least use in the temporary score, just to take it to a slightly different place. I knew for this one that I didn't want it to be, apart from the tune that Brendan Gleeson plays, I didn't want any Irish music or even Irish-sounding music used in the film, because that always puts us in a safe, homey, dilly-eye-die kind of place that I wanted to shake up from the start. So Carter Burwell, who's brilliant and might be somewhere around the vicinity sometime today, he came up with this amazing, very non-Irish score that almost touches on. We talked about and listened to some Indonesian gamelan music, which is not Irish, but somehow the sense of it worked. So we discussed that, and I think Carter ran with that and came up with some beautiful, strange. I think he used the celeste, which is a type of sort of xylophone type instrument. I'm not very good at music, but and it just sounds. It takes it to a peculiar place. The whole movie, I think, and it keeps you unsteady and puts you in a weird place. And I think that's part of what we were both aiming for with this.
Yeah, I mean, and talking about opening it up beyond the Irish reference points, I think this is a movie that a lot of people see and recognize aspects of human relationships, whether or not they're specific to a small island in Ireland at this particular time period. I mean, specifically friendships that go sour. Yeah. And I wonder, I mean, if anyone saw Brendan Gleeson's opening bit on SNL, there's a great play on the concept of this movie with him and Colin Farrell, because it is inherently funny, this idea of two really good friends who suddenly one of them doesn't want to be friends anymore. So what happened? Did you lose a buddy, or?
Well, it seems funny, but mostly I just wanted to, like, the starting point was to try and capture the sadness of a breakup, be it a love breakup or a friendship one. But it was almost more the love thing was what I was trying to tap into, you know, on being on both sides of that. The person who has to break up with the other person is sometimes in an equally horrible position as the person who gets dumped. But to treat the sadness of both sides as truthfully as possible was the main thing we wanted to get right with this. So even though that sounds, you know, bleak and horrible, it is funny, but the funniness of it wasn't what the first thing we were going for.
The other thing is, I mean, you use the word sad a lot, and there are a lot of sad undercurrents, not only in this film, but in everything that you've made, and yet at the same time, there's an element of hope, whether it's hope for reconciliation or something else, someone's resilience on some level. And I wonder just how much that's important to you. A lot of times people talk about how there's no real drama without an element of hope.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I definitely feel it's true in my stuff, although I think the moments of hope are sometimes hard to find. But I know I always kind of take umbrage with sort of reviews of some of my plays where they just see them as kind of nihilistic or black or and I always feel like they've missed, like, it could be just two lines of hope in a dark story. But I think that's enough if you're paying attention or you're trying to tap into it. So yeah, I think that's true. I think in Bruges has it. I think there's a lot of it in Billboards too, and I think it might be harder to see in this one, but I think it's there as well.
Yeah, I don't.
Even if it's not in the main characters, but that's a sort of spoiler kind of thing.
Right.
So
We won't go into that in too much detail, but I mean the other part of it that is notable is that it does feel like in all of these movies, you're rooting for something to happen. I mean, do you get inside the headspace of your characters? Do you write backstories for them? Do you write from different perspectives and pull them together? How does that work for you?
Yeah, you do have to try and get into everyone's head and see each character almost as the hero of the piece. I think even that's why there's almost no subsidiary characters, because even the subsidiary ones are the lead actor in their own story, as we all are. So you have to treat every character as if they're like they've got their own spin-off show coming. But backstory, I'm very lazy about, and I love it when an actor can bring that crap to it, because it saves me a lot of time.
Do you want to know? Do you ask Colin Brennan, tell me what happened to you when you were a child?
Only if they want to share it with me. I think I always rehearse like for 2 or 3 weeks before each of the films, and that is a time for all of that stuff to come up. I don't really put a stamp on that stuff, but if an actor came up with something that I thought was completely the text didn't justify, then there's definitely a conversation to be had. But I've never so far had anything that was there's never been any disagreements. There can be different shadings of the truth, but I've definitely never sort of disagreed with anything an actor has come to me with.
What about the world that you build? I mean, this particular film, because there's a war on, the characters are sort of aware of it, but it's always on the periphery. And that seems like a very specific choice on your part to kind of to remind the audience there is this larger conflict going on, but there's also this very personal conflict, and that's really where these people's priorities lie. Again, something I think a lot of people can relate to.
I mean, that is kind of how we live, I guess, as well. And it's not too different back then. But yeah, it was interesting to have the Irish Civil. I mean, the Irish Civil War was pretty horrible, as most civil wars are. You don't really get very nice civil wars. But it was like brother against brother and family against family, who had been fighting on the same side literally a year before, and one isn't. I think those scars are probably still there today. But you don't need to know any of that to enjoy or to understand this story. But I think it just adds a nice sort of mirroring or metaphorical kind of dimension to the movie. But it's not necessary to know too much about it. But I do think, for me, just the way that friendships can sour and things can become unforgivable really quickly is what the core of the two fellas, their story is, and that sort of mirrors wars, I guess.
In that respect, none of your work is really explicitly political, but there is an element of there's a political dimension to the reality of these characters and the world that they're in. So, for example, Pillowman I think about as one where you sort of dance up to that, almost a metaphorical element or an allegorical element where people could say, this is a play set in a dystopian world, so clearly you must be commenting on things that are going on in our society. But at the same time, it's 2-3 people in a room having a conversation, and it's really about that dynamic. And I wonder how much you sort of deal with these questions of, how much of what's going on in the world today do you want your work to kind of comment on?
That's a good question. With it going to be a terrible answer. I kind of tend to keep my personal politics out of it as much as I can, sort of as a rule, but I think they always kind of tend to bubble through, and like I can see in all of my stuff the gentle politics or issues that I have with the world and politicians and freedom of speech and all of those things. But I don't like to be heavy-handed about what I believe in the work. But I think it just comes through Pillowman, especially. I think, but even with Pillowman, when you're, it's a play about sort of fascist society where a writer gets interrogated because of the short stories he's written, displeased the government. It seems like you still. Obviously, I'd be on the writer's side in that, but you still have to paint the detectives as rounded, interesting, believable human beings too. So that's sort of partly why I kind of keep my surface politics out of most of my stuff, to allow that freedom to write characters who you disagree with, but you still believe in them wholeheartedly.
Do you worry about censorship, or do you ever feel the pressure to self-censor when you're writing?
See, I think every writer does. Every writer always has. So yes, but probably my level of self-censorship is different to what a censor would have. But I do think we're going in a more dangerous place over the last 10 years or so.
And that's not affecting the way that you work?
No, but recently I've had theatre companies say, we'll do your play if you change these words. Yeah. I say, if you think the play is whatever you think it is, don't put it on. Or maybe those words are in there because I want to discuss this thing on stage. I think they do seem to be taking away the trust or the intelligence of an audience, Put it in the program notes. We disagree with a lot of the words in this play, but see for yourself. I think that would be a more honourable way to go about it.
Well, I mean, and just to bring this full circle, and then we can see if there are questions from the audience. One thing that you do a very good job at is showing us people who sometimes say things that you probably shouldn't say if you're a well-meaning individual. I mean, how do you navigate that in a way to basically say, I'm not endorsing the way this person talks or the actions they've taken. I'm just imagining a scenario in which this character would behave in this particular way.
Yeah, well, you just try to paint that person truthfully and paint the reaction to that person truthfully. And you hope that the piece of work as a whole represents your feelings about the subject, which are hopefully not that character's, and you hope that an audience can see that. I think there's got to be a lot of trust, more and more trust between the writer and the audience. But I think it's as I say, people trying to get in the way of that. I don't think we have those issues. I think we trust our intelligence more. I think it's people who think they're smarter than us trying to take care of us is the problem.
If you have questions, just stick your hand in the air. We'll start with the woman back here. Yes, in the black shirt.
Hi. Your work is certainly unique. However, I can't help but make comparisons, and I'm sure everyone does the same thing. The Kohn brothers, kind of on the American side. Could you talk a little bit about that overlap of an actress and just they're coming at it from an American sensibility, you're coming in from European?
I thank you for the comparison. I've always liked that. I remember seeing Blood Simple when I was like 13, 14 when it first came out, and have watched everything they've done as soon as it came out ever since. And obviously got to work with Francis and met Joel through that process too. I guess they like cinema, they like blackly comic stories, they like shaking things up a bit. So I guess all those things I can see in both our movies. Beyond that, I think they love actors. I love actors, and they do too. And they love the joy of writing. So I see all those things, but thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
I have two questions. One is, when you have a story in your head, how do you decide if it's going to be a play or a movie? And my second one, it's sort of a comment, but I've read, I think, all of your plays, and there are a couple that I've never had an opportunity to see stage. And I don't know why, especially in the trilogy, The Beauty Queen of Leenane is done often, the other two, why not?
I just repeat the question real quickly because I know there's people in the back who didn't hear it. So
I'll give me more time to think.
the first part was, when you have a story in your head, how do you decide it's a play or a movie? The second part, Can you give me the sort of
The
summary?
plays, why aren't the bad plays staged as much as the good ones?
The earlier ones.
No,
That's not fair.
no, I agree. Thank you. Yeah, I liked them. I think Beauty Queen, because it played on Broadway, theatre companies around America would freely,
Also in London several times.
Yes. And it's got two very strong female lead parts as well. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's always done regionally and always seems to do well. I especially like the Lonesome West, the third part of that trilogy. And I've been sort of I want to get a good production on in London and New York at least. And sometimes when that happens, it'll start coming around to the rest of the country. But I'd really like to do that one especially. I think if a story is just like 4 characters and it's just set in a couple of locations, it's going to naturally be a play. I think I think Bruges and Banshees, it uses landscape and towns and geography as a character, so that's another reason to make it a movie.
Seems like Hangman could have gone either way.
But that's all set in one room, basically. So if anything's sort of in one room, it's either going to be a play or a bad film. Not always the case. Not always the case. What leaps to mind, Eric? Good films set in one room.
They exist.
Yeah. What's the one? Michael Caine and Laurence Olivier. But that was yeah. A Death Trap. Yeah, but that's from a play. Is there any good films?
Frost
Nixon.
Nixon, which was a play.
That was a bad play and a bad film. Sorry, just kidding. Had to go there.
Played.
Anyway.
Take a question here.
Thanks.
And I was wondering, this is just something that I've wondered for so long, having read your plays and as well, not only having seen your films, but read the screenplays. When you write characters, other than the situations where you have maybe an actor in mind, what is it like once you've casted or you're deciding on casting and you've written a specific character and you're looking for maybe a specific performance? Sorry if I'm kind of botching the question. It's crazy being able to talk to you.
It's a question about
I'm liking
casting.
this. Keep going. It's stroking my ego.
I'm just wondering.
Is it about it changing between the page and the actor, or?
Yeah. What do you look for in that in the change between maybe the page of the actor or the connections between those? Is there anything?
Well, I guess there are two versions of how I write. Certain things are written specifically for actors. So all 4 leads in Banshees were written for those actors. The Frances McDormand and Sam Rockwell parts were written for those guys. So you sort of have how you think they speak or how they have spoken in other movies in your head when you're doing that stuff. I knew Sam as well, having worked on the previous one, so I had his offstage voice to write for. But plays, you just go into, I think, every character. Even the young girl, for instance, in Hangmen. But you have to be in a 15-year-old's head to do that. But what kind of actor they'll be or what they're going to bring to it is free. It's open. It could be anything. So I don't ever have a very, very strict picture of what that's going to be. Weirdly though, especially after the first production of a good production, I can't help but hear that actor's voice forevermore. Like the first version of Beauty Queen, I still have those 4 actors. They did it in Galway and made it all the way through to Broadway. But every time I reread the play, it's their voices, and it always will be, I think. And sadly, 2 of them aren't around anymore, but their voices always are.
Yes, on the aisle here.
Yes.
Then we'll go back.
Okay. You and I are old enough to remember the days when if you missed seeing a movie during its run, you either had to try to catch it at a secondhand screening, or you missed seeing the movie. And if you missed watching something
watching it on TV. So, if someday the holodeck technology from Star Trek: The Next Generation became possible, could that be a way that if a celebrity play like when I saw Hugh Jackman, The Music Man, was only playing in New York, that could be able to play in theaters around the world with holodeck technology? And if you miss seeing a play or tickets were sold out in its run, could holodeck technology be the answer to that?
This question is going to be really fun to summarize for those who didn't hear it. It's about holodeck technology and the possibility of salvaging things you might not be able to see. I will say that we're seeing more and more of plays that are being captured, and after Hamilton was streaming, there's more and more of that. I don't know if we've seen much of that with your work. I wonder how you feel about sort of that.
I probably don't know enough about holodeck technology to.
Technology would make it possible to recreate the theater of the actors. Now, it would work for most species like humans, but it would not work for beta.
I think I'm against that.
No holodeck for your plays. But what about recording them and having them watched that way at home? I mean,
I used to sort of be. I've always been averse to any of my plays being made into movies, for instance, because I feel like you have to go to the theatre to see those stories told. And that's because of that. I had been sort of against the whole streaming, going to a cinema to stream it, to see a live stream or a recorded version of that live stream. But lately, I've come around to, most people can't travel if they live in Kansas to get to New York or wherever else. There's and can't afford it too. And that's the major problem I have with theatre these days. It's just too expensive. So that cuts out, the majority of people. So I have come around to the idea of that whole streaming thing. I think it needs to be sort of limited, and it shouldn't feel like you're just going to watch TV. But I do like the idea now, the democracy of that.
saw a hand way in the back. I don't want to neglect it, but maybe it's not there anymore. So why don't you go ahead, and then we'll go back.
I've had a lot of that dribbling out thing, and they usually end up in the waste paper basket at the end of it. Yeah, so I've always sort of tried to write one new thing a year, but you can tell by my lack of having work out that most of them are rubbish. But sometimes you go back to something, and even if it's just the first 5 pages, if you're surprised by it and you're interested, and I've usually forgotten what happens after that, but if you're intrigued enough and you still think that's good, you can restart, I feel, and go on. But my process is, even though I don't know what's going to happen next, I usually can sense after a couple, I write longhand, and I can sense after a couple of pages if it's sort of starting to take a wrong turn, and if it is, I'll sort of go back those 2 pages and try to go in a different direction. As much as I don't know what's going to happen next, I think every day when you're coming up with new stuff, you're getting ideas for things that are in the next scene or in the next 20 minutes, etc. And that's when it's going well, you're just trying to keep up. When it's going well, you're trying to keep up with what the characters are saying to each other, and what the plot is making you come up with.
I saw a hand way back there, so let's.
Weirdly, all 4 movies have had almost the exact same budget, which is about 15 million, which is not small at all, but it's not like, obviously, anything bigger than 15. I think the last one it was weirdly, even though it seems like it's a smaller budget thing, I don't know if it's because of filming in Ireland or maybe it's just inflation, but it's a little bit higher than that. But basically, they're all of a piece in terms of budget. And when I think you do something at that level, budget-wise, the interference from above isn't there. So, like, I insist on no notes on the script and very little of that stuff when shooting. I had enough of that on in Bruges to be able to say never again. Luckily, I've worked with Searchlight on the last two, and they've been really good about leaving me to my own devices. And I think that makes things much more singular and interesting if there isn't too many, if it's one single voice just expressing everything directly to an audience, you know.
We have time for just one or two more, so why don't you go ahead?
Martin, thank you so much for being so generous in spirit, trust that you talked about, and trusting our intelligence. It's been really refreshing to hear that from you.
Thank you.
So my quick question is, you talked about how in childhood or being a young person, you were always into films, and I'm wondering at what point did you go from a dream to reality in that transition of this is what I always wanted to do, this is what I dreamed of doing, perhaps, to oh my gosh, I'm doing it, now I'm a filmmaker, and going through all those fears of actually going from this and the heart space to realizing the reality. Can you comment on that a little?
Well, I mean, I wasn't really into writing when I was at school, for instance, but I left school quite young, at 16, and was unemployed for a bunch of years. But during that time, started to write, and it was mostly bad movies and then bad TV plays and et cetera, et cetera. But I just kept at it, mostly because I wanted a job that didn't have a boss, and I thought writing is the best way to go about that. And after like 8 years of it, like with anything, it got better. But I went through the things I wanted to write for, like TV or movies, but they were all crap, and just kept going though. And then I had one of those books, the Writers and Artists Handbook, which would show you how to format things or send in addresses of places. And then I turned over to the next page, and it was theatre, and it had like addresses of theatres you could send an unsolicited script to. So I thought, okay, I hate theatre, but that's the next page. I might as well give it a go. But after the 8 years, things were getting better. And I think the combination of that, of sort of knowing that the dialogue was getting better in the plots, combined with a slight sort of disrespect for what I saw as everyday theatre, was a sort of perfect combination. So that all sort of happened when I was 24, and during that sort of next year I wrote all of those plays, Beauty Queen and even Pillowman first version and all that. And then went to, but I was kind of a shy guy going into the rehearsals for that. I didn't really know actors or directors or how to stage a play. I never directed any of my stage plays. But I kind of knew how the characters should sound and what the truth of them would be. And I worked with a very wonderful director, Gary Hines, who did Beauty Queen. And that's a she, actually, Gary. But she was perfect as my first director because she was completely welcoming to a writer and would go to me for my opinion on everything. And I was like 24, and that's the way it should always be, I think, but it isn't a lot. And because of that, I kind of felt empowered to speak to actors and always have done. And the knowledge that I gained through that was, on like first day of shooting the films, you're terrified. But then I realized I had that tool, and that's one of the few tools you really need is how to communicate with actors.
All right, we'll take the last question in the back here.
Hi. You had mentioned that you don't really write for audiences, you're writing for yourself, but how do you find the difference, generally speaking, between American audiences and British audiences, either theater or play, and just however you want to expand on that?
It's surprisingly very, very similar. I think we all laugh at the same things and get sad about the same things and have the same sort of hopes and dreams. It's really not, even over like 25 years, there hasn't been too much of a differentiation. Some of the things we laugh at are slightly different, and the level of sound of that laughter can be different. It's better over here, but very conservative back home. But it's surprising. And I've actually seen like translations of my plays in like Japan and other countries. Japan's quite quiet, but everyone seems to. We're all kind of the same the world over, and everyone sort of seems to get the same stuff, I think.
So there's no inside jokes in Banshees where it's sort of like you want people who might be seeing this movie, say, later today to know, like, well, if you were Irish, you'd laugh a little bit harder at that particular line.
Oh, yeah, I'll tell you which places you should laugh at. All of the donkey stuff is really funny. No, but it'll be intriguing to hear. Like, we went to Venice and Toronto with this, and of course it's a little quieter when it's in translation in Venice, but they laughed at a lot of the same stuff. But I hope you guys laugh louder than the Canadians. That's a dare. Let's just beat them, unless you're Canadian. And they're lovely people too. Oh, God.
I think we could squeeze one more in.
Hi.
Very important.
Woohoo. I refer you to my previous answer.
No, a silly question just to end all this. Have many people asked you what a banshee is?
Not too much, and I wonder if it's just being scared of. Huh? Yeah, and you don't. To be honest, you don't really need to know the minutiae. There's enough in the film to if you don't know what a banshee is. But I think we've all got a vague kind of idea of that.
Does anyone here want Martin's definition of a banshee?
Or Eric's? How about Eric's definition of banshee?
Sort of a spiritual creature of sorts.
That was a terrible answer, wasn't it? Jesus Christ. Okay, let's go with
you
mine.
better explain.
No, it's a bit darker. It's like a ghostly woman figure, sometimes old, sometimes young, who would scream to portend the death of someone in a house in Ireland. Yeah, happy stuff.
By the way,
Yes. It was, yeah, I thought it was all. Oh, I should have done some research before.
that doesn't spoil anything about the movie, by the way. So, well, thank you everyone for being here, and this was
Thanks,
great.
everyone.
Thanks, Martin.